Within the landscape of Genshin Impact's team building, there are two archetypes, Hypercarry and Quickswap, comprising the majority of all conventional parties you see today. In any character guide or discourse about them, you're practically guaranteed to see those terms being thrown around, although in recent years, Quickswap has been replaced with whatever the party's mechanism for DPS is, like Taser, Hyperbloom, Freeze, and whatnot. While distinct in their own ways, they're not mutually exclusive from each other. In a Quickswap team, you'll naturally have one character taking up more field time than the others during periods of time where everyone's got their buffs and stuff online and you're actually doing the damage. Likewise, a Hypercarry team will see you switching from your main DPS to supports to reactivate buffs. The game's combat revolves around shuffling through your 4 party members to power up the whole team as much as possible, but semantically, the key difference between a Hypercarry and Quickswap is that of focus. Quickswap teams focus on a specific goal, most commonly to drive as much of a certain reaction as possible, while Hypercarry teams, as the name implies, focus on a specific character to drive that main unit's power to as high of a level as possible. Between the two, Hypercarry teams are definitely used less often, whether intentionally or not, and though that has nothing to do with their viability or performance, as there are still plenty of successful Hypercarry teams, I wanted to go through the archetype in more detail to highlight some challenges with designing them, so let's talk about it. Elaborating more on what I mean by focus, depending on how loose your definitions are, all Quickswap parties technically feature a carry. Whoever deals the most damage among the 4 can be given that label. Take Taser for instance. Generally you have 1 Animo unit for crowd control and absorption, 1 Hydro unit for Hydro application, and 2 Electro units. The selling point of Taser is that everyone contributes equally, therefore making the team very consistent as you don't have to really time or position anything other than the element you want the Animo unit to absorb, which is typically Electro. Otherwise, you can mash your face on the keyboard and let the team do its thing. This also makes it one of the more open-ended teams in the game since the requirements for executing it are pretty lenient. As such, variations of Taser are built upon a named individual like Sucrose Taser, Ayato Taser, Hazel Taser, what have you. Whatever the case, the focus of the party is on the extrinsic mechanic, often the reaction. If you pick a character like Shogun and look at one of her viable teams being Hyperbloom, then her role in that team is to facilitate Hyperbloom. With her damage and application stemming from her skill, she can apply her pressure regardless of if she's on field or not. But with how, for instance, Nahida also has off-field application, it really doesn't matter who you decide to put on field unless you invest more in one character or not. To make it easier to differentiate, it's best to look at the other end of the spectrum. The focus of a Hypercarry team is on a specific unit, whether that unit's pressure is derived from a reaction or not. But normally, Hypercarry teams take into account the on-fielder's own personal damage output, with the rest of the party constructed around facilitating their uptime as much as humanly possible. So TLDR, Quickswap teams are focused on a collective goal, such as a reaction, with the main on-fielder's own damage supplementing it, while Hypercarry is the inverse. The on-fielder's own damage is the focal point with the reaction or collective goal supplementing. Some exceptions apply of course. One could argue Nilu's Bountiful Bloom is in fact a Hypercarry team since it literally cannot be done without her, but at the same time she doesn't necessarily have to be the active character to achieve this effect. All she has to do is apply Golden Chalice and for 30 seconds anyone in her team is capable of spawning a Bountiful Core. However, the cores are indeed made extremely powerful by her own HP and can therefore indirectly be considered her own damage. We'll come back to this later in the video. Unless you're a Geo character, rest in peace, every single person in this game, yes, even physical units, can contribute to a reaction-based team in some capacity. How efficiently they're able to determines whether they're viable or not. Despite Racer having Electro application, and frankly pretty good application if you think about it, the need for him to be the active character gets in the way of him seeing gainful employment in Taser teams, which ideally function best when you're constantly swapping between units to keep up skills and bursts. Some DPS, also known as off-field units, are so powerful in this game because they take up minimal field time to do their job, making them naturally very consistent as they don't overstep on their teammates' rotations. The side effect of this is that they're usually never considered the main carry since they're more often supporting someone else or the whole party rather than being supported. Units whose personal DPS mandates being on field for extended periods of time can be and usually are regarded as a Hypercarry. Yoimiya is one such example. Her normal attack-centric playstyle will find her being the active character for any party she's in, automatically making any viable team with her involved centered around her. And no, her elemental burst is not sufficient enough for her to be an off-fielder, especially considering Pyro's main reactions are based on damage, not application. Furthermore, her damage is concentrated on normal attacks, not her skill or burst compared to someone like Xiangling, so she's explicitly a Hypercarry even though a lot of her damage is ultimately amplified through Vaporize. On a side note, with Vaporize and Melt multiplying the damage of the triggering attack, I would consider them Hypercarry reactions. So for Hu Tao, Diluc, Yoimiya, I would even go so far as to say Xiangling can be a Hypercarry with how stupid broken her Pyronado is, but she's mostly off-field anyway. Elements do play a big role in this. Pyro units have a higher chance of being main damage dealers given that it's the only one with amplifying reactions. Meanwhile, Hydro is seldom the star of the show since it performs best when supporting and or driving one of its countless powerful reactions, that is unless your name is Ayato or Child. Cryo, despite having a reaction that can be extremely effective in the right circumstances, often finds its damage dealers being hypercarries on account of Freeze not doing any damage itself, and because Melt is an amplifier. This is especially true if you have Shunho. A theoretical benefit of Hypercarries is that Genshin has no shortage of units who specialize in buffing the active party member to high heaven. It can either be indirectly, such as facilitating reactions like Fischl and Xingqiu, or direct stat enhancements like Bennett, Kujo-Sada, Nahida, Shunho, and Kazuha to name a few. Provided you have most of the meta-relevant characters, constructing a Hypercarry team cannot be more straightforward. On a surface level, Quickslot parties appear more stringent with what they need. A Hyperbloom team necessitates 3 elements at minimum to be executed properly, only really giving you a free 4th slot. But you stand to gain very little by bringing any other element except maybe Anima, and only a marginal amount. Quickslot teams are very flexible with party members, but only members within the elements that are conducive to it, if that makes sense. For Hypercarry, you can ostensibly play around a bit more. Shogun Hypercarry coalesces as many stat boosts as humanly possible into her elemental burst to deal big damage. Of course, there is an optimal setup for this. I believe it's Kazuha, Bennett, and Sada, but you can basically do whatever the hell you want since you're not depending on any specific reaction. You can go the aforementioned team, or you can go Raiden National. You basically need her, a healer or shielder, and some off-field damage or buffs. Shell, same thing. Swirl is not a priority for him, so you can go him, Farazan, Bennett, and Zhongli, or you can throw an Albedo for that plunging attack damage, or you can go double Pyro, double Animo. Whatever units that help Shao do more damage are fair game. On paper, Hypercarry units are easier to design because it starts and ends with them, which brings us to the first challenge of designing them, that is starts and ends with them. Hypercarries and by extension their teams can be very black and white at times. They're either good enough or they're not. There are some that output comparable damage to Quicksaw teams, including but not limited to Ayaka, Hutao, and Shogun. But then you have a few that fall short like Eula, Yoimiya, Ito, Wanderer, and Xiao, assuming for the latter two you don't have Farazan maxed out. Not saying they're bad or not viable, they just don't climb as high. Ordinarily, a character's damage ceiling wouldn't make or break them. Several units are kind of meh on their own but get supplemented by the help of their element. Kuting is an emblematic example of this. The advent of Quicken made her go from a subpar electro carry to a more than serviceable reaction on fielder. Granted, she's not top tier or anything, but it was enough to make her a worthwhile contender. Though I feel like it's mostly an aggravate team at that point, not everyone gets to piggyback off something else. If their ceiling doesn't climb as high and they have no alternative side hustle quote unquote, what you see is what you get. Wanderer and Xiao belong to one of the best elements in the game, except that element is more known for driving others, not powering itself up. Their max damage output comes from them and the rest of their team. Animo isn't going to do them any favors. Just to repeat, they're not bad by any means. Both of them can clear everything in the game relatively easily, not to mention they have very unique playstyles to boot. But they get marginal assistance from their element and their base numbers are not high enough to work off just that alone. Hypercarry teams do still account for reaction damage, but that's only if it's conveniently accessible. There are units who don't get any help whatsoever though, like Gita and Eula. Eula's got the sauce. She has numbers, no one can deny that. But not only can she struggle to consistently stack up those numbers, but she receives no help from elements. Worse yet, what little external support that is available to her doesn't help her as much as it needs to. Ito's base numbers are also pretty good, not as much as Eula mind you, but still very high up there. However, he's so hamstrung by the lack of an actual good reaction like her that he relies on other Geo members to make up that difference. Due to their inherent shortcomings, you have to forcibly min-max them to put them on the same level as Quickslot reaction teams, consequently diminishing just how much freedom you have in supports. And it's not just the not quite as good ones either. Top tier hypercarries like Shogun, Ayaka, and Hutao also need specific units to be optimal on them. You don't get a whole lot of legroom. Shogun hypercarry needs a significant amount of power loaded into her to offset what you're likely not getting from reactions, as evident by C6 Kujo-Sada often being paired up with her. Disregarding the freeze component, Shunho, among others of course, is integral to facilitating Ayaka's DPS, as the latter won't get any from Cryo. For some units, even with the best supports in the game, they still don't reach the limits of what a quick-swap team can do. On paper, hypercarry teams look flexible, but in practice they aren't because their insufficient numbers don't let them. And that's the next challenge, balance. Hypercarry units are balanced on the same playing field as quickswap units despite not always having the concessions they do. Characters with the luxury to be used in quickswap teams have access to the same universal privileges as hypercarries. Fielding Bennett to give Xiao a massive attack boost, that same attack boost can go to Child who can vaporize to get even more damage. Yella's total damage buff from her ultimate sounds like a pretty sweet deal on Eula, but it's an even sweeter deal on I'll Hate Them who gets that and can get more damage from Dendro reactions. The only real exception to this is units that were designed specifically for hypercarry such as Sada and Shunho, but all the more reason why the person they're supporting has to have a damage ceiling that either matches or exceeds quickswap teams. The developers should be aware of the fact that these units are relinquishing the immense DPS potential from these reactions and make them stronger at base than those who can easily integrate said reactions or swap out to give more uptime to their party members. Going back to Bountiful Bloom, Nilou would have been much less efficient if she was the only member on her team who could create Bountiful Cores, because that would make her a hypercarry. The fact that her entire party can make them is why she gets all the benefits of a hypercarry team with the ease of use of a quick swap one. Shogun and Nahida are kinda the same way. They can be used as on-field hypercarries, but they have off-field properties that synergize with reactions to be given the choice to run that approach, not be obligated to. What I'm trying to say is, if a character is forced to go hypercarry, whether circumstantially or intrinsically, they should be given a significantly higher base power budget to account for the reduced access to external supplementation. You can't give two characters the same baseline but then give one of them access to more stuff. That's just not fair balance. Someone who can do fewer things or has a harder time doing those things should be able to do those fewer things better. Venti's not a hypercarry, but he demonstrates this very well. Comparatively, Zhongli, Shogun, and Nahida have a wider range of use cases than Venti. I don't think anyone disagrees with that. But in the one field he does specialize, he's so overpowered that no one comes even close. He doesn't work in every situation, but in the ones that he does, he's hands down the best character in the game. That's how it should be for hypercarries. The less ways to boost the character's damage, the bigger the boost should be. Genshin's hypercarries inherently have less to work with on the basis of 1. Relying heavily on their own base damage and numbers, rarely if ever benefiting from reactions, and 2. Necessitating ample field time, therefore disqualifying them from teams that demand more frequent rotations. Granted, balance can be difficult to premeditate. Unless they want to hire a team of theory crafters to number crunch and playtest until they're blue in the face, it's hard to predict just how strong or weak a character will be. At the same time, MiHoYo won't do balance patches out of concern for damaging the impartiality of the game. In their defense, I can understand that if they nerf a character, everyone who pulled for it will be rightfully pissed off, interpreting it as if they got scammed. If they buff a character, that's just as bad too. Think about it. Say they decide to buff, I don't know, Sino. You better believe everyone's gonna come at them begging for buffs to literally every other character in the game. They only made an exception for Zhongli since the outrage was so overly palpable. Speaking of Zhongli, the buffs he got basically turned him from a hypercarry support into a universal one. Prior to 1.3, it only used to benefit Geo units and protect effectively against Geo damage. Then it got changed to benefit all units and protect against all damage. They could find ways of buffing characters, such as releasing a new support, but once again, that new support can be used for non-hypercarry teams just as much as it can be used for hypercarry teams. If that support is only allowed for hypercarries, the hypercarry they're supporting has to also be strong, otherwise it won't make a difference. Point being, units who lack the means to moonlight a different role or team should be given more accommodations. We have a lot of really cool characters who get shot in the foot by not being as versatile or circumstantially lucky as others. I know I said in the past that the game is easy enough to where you can play mid or even low tier characters and still make it work. It's the satisfaction aspect though. The Genshin fandom has a lot of players who are dedicated to their mains. Some a little too dedicated, but it can be frustrating when you're essentially being punished for playing your favorite character. It's unrealistic to expect every character to be on the same power level as others, but this is more of a design issue that just so happens to pertain to relative balance. It's common sense. A character who gets less external options should have more internal options to balance it out and vice versa. Diluc, Eula, Please, Sino, Ito, Wander, Xiao, Dia, Ningguang, Yanfei, they could all be so much better if they had just a little bit more. It sucks that a character is viewed less favorably because they just don't do as much as everyone above them. But what do you guys think? Do you believe hypercarries are at a disadvantage compared to quickswap units, or do you think they don't have it as rough as I'm making them out to be? Feel free to share in the comments down below. That's going to be it for today, so if you enjoyed the video, I'd appreciate it if you left a like and subscribed. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter @Vars, join my Discord server, and check out my other discussion videos if you haven't yet. But till next time, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.